It's my pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker, Dirk Helbing, who's one of the most innovative and influential complex system scientists in the world today. Dirk has a background in physics and mathematics. He was professor at the Institute for Transport and Economics at Dresden University of Technology, and in 2007 he was appointed Professor of Sociology in Modelling and Simulation at ETH Zurich. Since 2008 he's been elected a member of the German Academy of Sciences. His research interests reach from traffic science to crowds and disaster management to biologically inspired logistics. Apart from developing information portals to accelerate scientific innovation, he's particularly interested in socio-technical systems. He's chairman of the newly established ETH Competence Centre, Coping with Crises in Complex Socio-Economic Systems, which will develop computer models of crisis scenarios and finally provide decision support for politics and economy. Recently, he's been the main supporter and representative of Futurist, and this will be the subject of his talk today. Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here to report to you about this huge, large-scale project we are preparing at the moment for the European flagship core. The European Union is going to spend 100 million euros per year over a time period of 10 years on 2 or 3 so-called flagships in the ICT area. And the question is, what is the best way of spending this kind of money? And our answer to this is actually as follows. We state that humanity has actually explored the universe, and we know more about it than about the social group. At the same time, we are facing a lot of crises on Earth, for example, the financial crisis and others as well, and it turns out that we are not well enough prepared to tackle them. We don't know enough about society and how it works. We have to pay our attention to our Earth. And this is actually the goal of this flagship that we call Futurist. And there are more than 300 scientists behind it. Now, among the challenges humanity is facing in the 21st century are financial and economic crises, debts and inflation. All these problems have been worrying us in the last months, I would say. Even the stability of the European Union has been debated. Then corruption, organized crime, extremism, terrorism, war, epidemics, security and cyber risks, migration, integration, and environmental change are worrying us a lot. And in fact, Lizzie Bollinger of New York's Columbia University has formulated the issue as follows. The forces affecting societies around the world are powerful and novel. The spread of global market systems are reshaping our world, raising profound questions. These questions call for the kinds of analysis and understandings that academic institutions are uniquely capable of providing. Too many policy failures are fundamentally failures of knowledge. And we'll have to ask ourselves, why is that? So I restated the challenges on the previous slide a little bit more scientifically over here. That's my personal top 10 list of socioeconomic problems that I think should be addressed. Many of them are quite old and haven't been solved, and the question is there a chance to make progress over what has been done in the past? Now, why do we have all these crises? It relates to the fact that we have a lot of interdependencies in our today's world, and that creates complexity in socioeconomic, ecological, and technological systems. That means we find self-organization, emergence, or even chaos, and that implies limits of predictability and control. Now, why do we have had problems to put our knowledge that we gained in complexity science into practice? Of course, we know that complex systems behave in sometimes paradoxical ways, so when we try to influence them, then they could be quite resistant to change. And at other times, only very small perturbations of the system may create regime shifts, very unexpected changes in the system behavior. And some examples for that are obviously epidemic spreading or congestion spreading, or the failure of the interbank market, or even the breakdown of the former GDR. So theoretically, we know all this, but there was a big problem applying this to the real world. So we have more theoretical results about complex systems than practical applications that are well known. And I think the reason for this is that we have still a lack of quantitative models, and that's partially due to a lack of data and a lack of computational power, and that implies a lack of systemic predictions. We also don't have enough tested alternatives, and all this together implies systemic risks. However, these factors are about to change, and this is the good news, so we can make progress. But in order to understand a little bit more what creates systemic crisis, I have added a few additional slides. And many of the systems we need to be concerned about are networked systems. And networks, of course, create functionality, but also they provide the infrastructure for spreading of crises. And so what can happen is that small changes in the system, so-called perturbation, may challenge the system so much that part of it breaks down, and then this breakdown triggers other breakdowns in other parts of the system via the network connections. We call this cascade spreading. And here is a nice illustration of such kind of cascade effects. So we see over here table tennis balls that are fixed in mouse traps, and we have one single ball folding. And you see how it easily can affect the whole system. So this is how one may imagine these cascading effects that often cause the systemic crisis that we see. So often they start off with problems that may be contained, but they spread so quickly that they can sometimes harm the whole system. So on a global scale. Here is one example that illustrates that quite well. Some time ago, we had the situation that just one power line was switched off in order to transfer a ship of Meyerwerf. And that actually created blackouts all over Europe. So you see the black areas over here, and it ranges from Germany to Portugal. And you can also see another feature that's kind of unpredictable, it seems, where we do have the blackouts. It's a quite complex pattern of blackouts over here. But one important point is that the effect is very large scale. So in order to address these kind of problems, I think what we need is to combine the knowledge of different disciplines in order to create something like a techno, socio-economic, ecological knowledge accelerator. You sometimes call it a kind of multidisciplinary Apollo project for the social sciences. We need to speed up in order to close the knowledge gap that is opening up, because the pace at which we're facing global problems seems to be accelerating, and it's not good enough to do the aftermath. We want to be one step ahead, at least, in order to be able to avoid or at least mitigate crisis. In order to do that, we need to understand these systems. Obviously, we have to test them by computer simulations or some other tools in order to get an idea in advance, and to have already alternatives provided, so-called contingency plans, in case something happens. So the ultimate goal of the Futurist is to create a living Earth visualizer to simulate life on Earth and everything it relates to. And obviously that involves a lot of ICT challenges, not only of scalability and integration. I won't go so much into this. This is being worked out by computer scientists and ICT experts. It's certainly not my main field of competence. But besides supercomputing and visualization, there is another issue which is very important, which is availability of data. Quite recently, we have a lot of different kinds of data sets available that we didn't have and allow us to get a much better understanding of the social and economic world and also of the environment. So we have remote sensing, we have the internet, satellites, telecommunication, GPS, prediction markets, social networks, Web 2.0, Second Life, and all this, and last but not least, sensor networks. So this is creating huge amounts of data, and we're starting to learn about social systems things that we had very much problems to understand in the past because doing experiments or field studies was very costly and very time-consuming. So we are now facing a paradigm shift from a data-poor social science to a data-rich social science. And that, I think, can really change and revolutionize even our understanding of society and the economy. So what are the components of such a system, of this living Earth visualizer? Well, first of all, we need data collectors, of course. I show here the New York Stock Exchange, but it could also be all sorts of other data collection, sensor networks, measuring environmental change or whatever. And obviously what we want to do is to do data mining in order to find advanced warning signs of potential crises. And that would trigger off then supercomputing simulations in order to study what would be the possible impacts of that on the system, but also what are our options. So if we take certain policy decisions, how would it change the course of the system behavior? And of course, all of this would be based to a certain extent on data mining and modeling and computer simulation. We know that models may not be complete or they may not be correct and all this. So we cannot fully rely on computer simulation. We have to do complementary experiments, and also we have to look at the real world that we use empirical data. But we can also do experiments actually in the virtual world. There's Second Life, and some people over here, like Michael Seel, are studying this. There's Second Life and other multiplayer online games, so-called, some of them so-called series games, that allow us to understand or test social interactions. So, for example, certain decision rules or certain kinds of market exchange rules and these kind of things. So it's not true anymore that we have one history we cannot play with, because in the virtual world we can do experiments and test policies in advance to a certain degree of accuracy. Of course, it will never be perfect, but at least we can learn much more about the expected effects than we could learn in the past. And of course, we will also do real-world experiments. Then all the results gained by the data mining, the computer simulation, also these experiments, and in the virtual and real world, will be fed into decision arenas and presented to a scientific audience or policy makers or decision makers in the business world or the general public. And over there, the results shall be made understandable, and the different options shall be highlighted. And finally, based on this information, that means based on a better information that we had available in the past, there will be the decision-making process. That's how we imagine it. And we think that such a system would have a huge impact on different areas of society and economics. So science and education could profit from that. We will create an innovation accelerator, a knowledge accelerator. We could come up with personalized education. The public sector could profit from smart, sustainable cities, a better healthcare, better prediction of spreading of diseases, early discovery of that. We will come up with crisis observatories in order to be better prepared for risk management, and I will explain it in more detail later on. Business and industry will profit as well. Obviously, the financial sector needs some help to understand the dynamics of the system and also maybe to figure out alternatives. Managing complexity will be a big issue that is around in all areas of economics. And there are problems in the area of transport, traffic, and logistics that have to be addressed, but also in electrical power generation, which more and more becomes a decentralized system, and there are still some serious problems to be addressed. Finally, also, administration and governance should profit from our activities. We will engage into e-governance solutions. Institutional design will be an interesting challenge. And consultancy will profit from customized information services. So we think that the money invested by the EU into this project will pay off and pay off multiple times. The question is now, how plausible is it to come up with such a project? And as I indicated already, there are hundreds of scientists all over Europe in all sorts of different disciplines supporting this project. So this involves areas such as, of course, ICT, information communication technology, but also computational social science, transportation, economics, sustainability science, complexity science, interdisciplinary physics, and education, to list just a few of these areas. And we can build on a huge number of different projects that have been performed in the past in the European Union. So people who have built up this knowledge are likely also to contribute to this huge socio-economic project we are envisioning. Now, we managed to receive a large number of letters of support, including George Soros, by the way, but also letters of support of all sorts of scientific organizations, which is important because the organizations help us to get the different disciplines on board. So, as you can see over here, there's a sustainability area represented, physics of socioeconomic systems, ESSA, and many other areas. I cannot really show you all the letters here, by the way, online at www.Futurist.eu, and a lot more information. In particular, also the press response we had. So that is response in all the major news media in all major languages, but also the activities we're aiming at are featured by Science in Nature, and also a number of articles have been linked on our webpage to this. So we have invested quite a bit of time into the preparation of this. We try to identify grant challenges, so-called Hilbert programs, for the socioeconomic sciences, and I wouldn't say it's a completed thing. All these white papers that we are creating at the moment is more a starting point for a discussion in the community, and I ask you to contribute to this to improve the concepts further. So these white papers address issues such as social data mining and crisis forecasting capacities, data security and privacy, innovation accelerator, social simulation capacities and integrative systems design and all this. And we're also thinking about the challenge how to organize such a big project, because we cannot just scale up an integrated project by a factor of 50 or so. That wouldn't work well. So we have some good and innovative ideas that, if they would be implemented, would reduce the administrative load related to this particular EU project, and hopefully that will be approved. So please push for that. Once the document is ready, you will find it on the web. And I'd actually like to thank you already for the great support that I've experienced and my colleagues have experienced in the past for this project. Because obviously, a few persons cannot manage such a project to set up everything. So I had to rely on the help of many people, and I'm very grateful that you have been very supportive in the past. I'm now eventually turning to something more scientific, and of course one of the questions that I'm asked many times is it possible at all to do predictions for socio-economic environmental systems? Well, in the area of weather forecasting, the situation was quite bad a number of years ago, and weather forecasting has made so much progress with the sensor networks that have been built up. Still, it's a short-term prediction, admittedly, but it's useful, to know whether you need to take an umbrella or a suit or whatsoever. And also for agriculture, it's very important. So there's large values associated with knowing about the weather. And so I don't expect actually a long-term forecast for many areas, although there is Moore's law, obviously, that held over several decades. But altogether, short-term prediction would already be helpful to avoid or mitigate crisis. And I will show you an example later on that is related to a new concept of traffic light control. That is based exactly on short-term anticipation. So let's just assume for the moment that prediction would be doable. How would we try to approach it? So first of all, of course, we have to put different kinds of data together. In the case of disease spreading simulation, for example, we need to have demographic data and transport data and geographic data. On the side of the models, we also need different inputs. So, for example, we need agent-based models, but also the contact network. And altogether, we have to create multi-scale models, which can be quite challenging. But given all this, combining data and models, in principle, we can try to do forecasts, we can try to do scenario analysis, for example, assuming to shut down airports or not. And this has been done in the past, in fact, also to advise policies. So there would be predictions of these scenarios, analysis then based on priorities. Decision makers would take policy decisions. Now, in fact, I think we can do prediction to a certain extent. So we've been looking at many kinds of disasters, such as thunderstorms, for example, and the impact they would have on society and economics. And here we can see a pretty complicated network diagram that is indicating causal relationships. That means what kind of event would trigger off another event, potentially. And if you have such a diagram, it allows you to make a prediction about the likelihood of certain things to happen and about the sequence of events, certainly. So rather than having to run behind the events and see what happens and then activate your forces, you could say, okay, now we've seen the thunderstorm has struck, or it will be a problem in 24 hours from now, we can take preparations in order to suppress the spreading, so we can contain the problem and keep it much smaller. We're already there before the spreading process has arrived these different areas. And actually that can be put into a mathematical model. Although we don't have the exact data in many cases how to specify these values, we can work with example networks, for example, and see what would be the implications. And obviously the spreading of disasters very much depends on the kind of network. And the damage they create also depends on that, the speed at which the spreading takes place. And what we've been doing is we've been looking at different kinds of scenarios, different kinds of strategies to contain the problem, assuming that we have a certain amount of resources and distributed according to certain strategies. So we've been looking at damage-based strategies, putting our resources to the damaged nodes, or we have been looking at network-based strategies, basically putting our resources at those nodes that have large out degrees and could damage many sectors, or we have been looking at combined strategies, and it turns out that, first of all, if we don't invest enough resources, then there will be no effect. So then everything is wasted, basically. You have to invest a supercritical amount of resources to be effective. The other thing we see is delay is very bad. So you have to respond very quickly to be efficient. Otherwise, the damage has basically reached all the system before you start responding. And then it's very costly because you cannot contain the crisis anymore. So quick response is absolutely crucial. Unfortunately, there is no one strategy which is always the best one. You know, a simple rule that you could apply if you would be a fireman or something like that. Actually, everything depends on the kind of network and the resources and the time delay. Basically, you need to know your system in order to decide what is the best strategy in order to contain the problem. But at least we can learn about these systems before things happened and prepare better than we did before. Well, of course, people always say, but what about financial systems? Can we do predictions over there? And they're thinking of the stock markets, and to most people, they look unpredictable. But not everything in economics is about the stock market. So as you can see over here, already in the 80s, it happened in the US that consumption and wages diverged from each other, and a gap was created between that. And so you could have concluded that somehow forces would build up in the system, stress that would sooner or later be relieved. The question is, when would that happen? And it's a question that's probably much harder to answer, but at least the diagnosis of this problem could have been done, in fact. Moreover, we can again analyze cascading effects, such as the impact that the subprime mortgages have on lenders, on home builders, on markets, on the US economy and the world economy, and now the spending deficit problem that we had. All this has a logical connection, and it was quite surprising to me to see how surprised the experts were about the events happening. In principle, as we had many financial crises in the past, we should have these causality networks ready-made and know what would be possible next events. And what I cannot do is a prediction of the moments when these stock market trends go up or down. The DSRNet seems to be capable of this. But what we can do is still to identify probability distributions. So something can be done. And in fact, a lot of people in the financial markets do trend analysis and so on. So many people believe that there are certain moments where some predictability is there. And that's the way how many people try to make money. How successful they are, that's debatable. But anyway. I'd like to compare for a moment financial systems to traffic systems, because we know a lot about traffic systems today. And in fact, they're very complex traffic patterns, but if you study them over many years, then you discover that they're underlying elementary patterns, as the ones shown over here, and they can be understood by theoretical models, by models that say if we have this flow condition, then we would have this pattern or that pattern, for example. Now, it turns out, however, there are a number of factors that determine the course of action. So, first of all, to have a breakdown of the traffic flow, we need high flows in the beginning and a lack of capacity. But that's not enough. It's a probabilistic system, so perturbation of the traffic flow usually causes the breakdown. It can happen sooner or later. That's why we cannot predict the moment. But we could say under which conditions it will happen sooner or later. And before the breakdown, and also after the breakdown, we can make quite accurate predictions of travel times. Just predicting the moment is difficult, and we can still come up with a probability distribution. So we know more than that, in fact. We also know how to get rid of a big deal of congestion by changing the interaction between cars. So there are driver assistance systems today that you can buy. And apart from improving the comfort of driving, they could also be used in order to make the system more stable and to increase capacity by kind of collective effects. And you will see it in a few seconds. So at the moment we have simulated stop-and-go traffic, as is quite common. And it has been caused by these cars dropping in and causing a perturbation of the flow. Now we're speeding up the presentation of this video, but the inflow stays the same. And now we're turning on this traffic assistance system. What you will see is by slightly changing the interaction of vehicles, we can get rid of this stop-and-go traffic and create free traffic again. So things are possible. We can apply complexity science in order to solve some of the problems we have today. Another problem that we have been dealing with is the challenge of the Hajj. So within a few decades, the number of pilgrims has increased from a few 100,000 to more than 3 million, and it's growing further. And you know that a couple of years ago, there were quite frequent crowd disasters. And this is because all these people are gathering in one place and are performing certain religious ritual more or less at the same time. So it's extremely crowded. And one of these rituals is the stoning of the devil process, where 3 pillars that you see over here are stoned with small pebbles. They're representing the temptation by the devil, and stoning it represents the resisting this temptation. And in the past, there were crowd disasters around these pillars. That's why they have been reshaped in an elliptical way. But that was not enough. over here it happened that although this entrance is 40 meters wide, so it's a really extremely wide entrance, despite of this, it happened that there was a crowd disaster with more than 300 dead people in the free space. And first of all, one had to understand how these things happen in order to come up with a realistic and good solution. So as you can see over here, as there happened to be a camera, it was possible to do a flow analysis, and there is a merging of flows that created a bottleneck in principle. And you could say, okay, if there's a bottleneck, then the density goes up. And in fact, that happens, it goes up, and then as the density goes up, eventually the flow drops. And that means the number of people getting into the system stays the same, while the number of people getting out of the system drops a lot, which means the density is now increasing much faster. And sooner or later, it will become terribly dense. The first thing that we noticed was a surprising stop-and-go movement. And actually, that can be taken as an advance warning sign of a potential crowd disaster. It happens when the density exceeds a certain value and the flow starts to drop. But then further on, when the density was even higher, we found an even different kind of dynamics, which was called crowd turbulence. People are pushed around by the crowd in all possible directions. They're squeezed in between other people. And this is actually what pushes them on the crowd. They're falling, and other people cannot stop because they're pushed as well. And that's how things started in an area where so-called crowd pressure was highest. So we managed to identify 2 advance warning signs. Of course, one should not let it happen and wait until these warning signs appear. In fact, one should come up with solutions that are avoiding these high densities in the first place. So the Saudis have constructed a new Jamarat bridge with much more capacity. It's now 5-level, as you can see, with many different entrances and exits. They actually spent $1 billion on that, so it's the first $1 billion project, and the Futurist will be the next one. If the Saudis can do that, why shouldn't the European Union be able to do that? What was done is the following, that the flows were reorganized completely to have a unidirectional flow organization. And as a consequence of that, the situation changed from this one, where emergency vehicles almost couldn't move, to this one, where everything moved very smoothly. And the pilgrims were quite happy with that. Now, there were a lot of measures taken to be prepared, and among them were also video monitoring, automatic counting, flow analysis, and so on, and adaptive rerouting strategies, plus time scheduling. So people had a certain time at which they should do the stoning in order to avoid that too many pilgrims would do it at the same time. So I think we can actually solve real problems in the social and economic world. And people sometimes ask, okay, you've listed all these 10 problems. Do you really think we can solve these problems? Yes, why not? I mean, we should at least try. Solving maybe is not, we will have the ultimate solution, these problems will never occur again. But I really think if we understand much better what is going on in these systems, then we can come up with solutions that mitigate the situation, that keep crises much smaller, that avoid to have global scale problems. So one of the problems we're looking is conflict. And one area we're studying is Iraq, but also Jerusalem. And it turns out that there's actually a new kind of understanding of these problems. So what we really want to avoid is such a situation that we have a clash of cultures, right? And now politicians are talking a lot about integration these days, but integration is not a simple thing, as we know. And the problem is we don't understand when do people integrate. Here is a model actually for that. It's called the social norm model, which assumes that people have different preferences, you know, as an assumption that most people would agree with. And these different preferences imply that even if everybody wants to be cooperative, it may not be possible to be cooperative with respect to two kinds of populations at the same time. So you're trying hard, but you know somebody is always unhappy. I hope we can avoid that with the Futurist project, but we'll have to see. We're trying hard. Anyway, so there are a number of different situations that can result in this model, and one is a situation where everybody shows the own preferred behavior, and there's coexistence of people with different preferences. And then there is another solution where one population sets the norm and the other population adjusts, assimilates somehow. And both cases are known, but now we have a much better idea under which conditions we find this solution or that solution. And moreover, conflict seems to be related to certain areas in this parameter space. So once we understand that, and conflict is not happening everywhere, once we understand where in the parameter space it's happening, then we have a tool to potentially reduce conflict. Well, we're also thinking about crisis observatories for epidemic spreading and health risks. Of course, this will not all be done in series. There are many people involved, as I indicated already. And also crisis observatories for environmental change. And one for financial instabilities, for example. Now, I'd like to come back to this issue, and Didier Jeanette has probably explained it to you much better than I can ever do it. But it seems that markets, as compared to what some economic theories predict, are not fully efficient, and there seem to be bubbles and crashes. And now, obviously, instability can result from a number of reasons. So here's just a number of factors that contribute to nonlinear interactions in the financial system and could potentially create bubbles, among them herding effects, of course. Now, we have, of course, in physics, other models of bubbles, and maybe it's helpful to use them to think about the system. You know, there are different kinds of bubbles. So some of these bubbles are pretty harmless, like these ones over here. So nobody would object to having these kind of bubbles. When we boil water, we're pretty okay with bubbles. But, you know, there are other bubbles, the size of which is just too big, and they were very destructive, as this volcano outbreak shows. So we certainly want to avoid this size of bubbles. While maybe small bubbles are okay, so a little bit of instability may actually be good to rearrange, you know, the ranking in the system. And so people would say, how to detect bubbles after all? If you want to fight them, do you need to know what is a bubble or not? And that turns out to be very difficult. But I think actually we don't need to know what the bubbles are. We need to have a mechanism that makes sure that bubbles would not be able to grow beyond a certain size. So we don't need to know it. They would just be destroyed automatically by the right kind of market dynamics. And so the question is how to test it. If there are different kinds of possible exchange, how we would test the different mechanisms. So the classical approach is you think about a new instrument, implement it, and see what happens. But I think there are other ways. And in principle, we can apply agent-based computer simulation of financial markets or even the whole economic system, knowing that the accuracy will never be 100%, but it could still give stimulating insights. We could do behavioral economics experiments in the lab. We could play something like stress test scenarios under as realistic as possible conditions, something like a role play between different people who would try to cheat the system as it happens in reality and see, how robust is the system with regard to this. We could do also something like Second Life experiments, and also, apart from implementing a new rule all over the system, all over the globe, we could do it like biological evolution does it. Now, it has new solutions locally, and if they're good, then they're spreading eventually all over the system. But if they're not good, they're disappearing again. So why should we implement a solution globally before we know what is going to happen? And there's very nice work done by Stefan Turner, which you probably know. So he's come up with a simulation model for hedge funds, showing that basically the way they're operating, and in particular the interaction with the banks and their security mechanism, basically creates a crisis out of nothing. And I'm sure he's giving a presentation related to that, so I can go to the next subject, which is how to manage scarce resources. This is really a big problem. How to distribute resources best? And one problem I've been working about quite a lot is traffic. So I feel competent in that area. And here we have the scarce resource is space. And we have this problem actually in many different systems. So in the morning, everybody wants to travel into the city, and we have these kind of congestion problems. Or we have this problem when all the pilgrims are trying to stone the devil at the same time. But also in the cell, we have transportation processes towards the nucleus. And the question is, why don't we have congestion in the cell all the time? What is the biological cell doing better than we are doing? And we have been looking at this with experts on cells from Max Planck Institute in Dresden. And it turns out that the cell has a number of tricks it's applying when transporting these endosomes over here with materials in them towards the nucleus. So what happens is there's a fusion of these endosomes, there's a purification process, but moreover, there's a non-uniform motion. That means when it becomes crowded, not everybody tries to move forward at the same time. So we have done a computer simulation to look at different mechanisms. So just diffusion, or a combination with directed motion along so-called microtubuli as it occurs in reality. With this fusion and fission process and purification, and also mechanism B, but without fusion and fission or without directed transport, you can see that most of these solutions fail and create terrible congestion. So, we would not live for 100 years. We would just die. And here, that combination of tricks actually does the job. So we can learn from biology, and also in many cases we can learn from social systems, and vice versa, and social systems can also learn from other systems. So here in that case, actually, we came up with a solution for urban traffic flow that was inspired by the way pedestrians behaved. what we observed was that at bottlenecks, people were passing the bottleneck in an oscillatory way. So a number of people going from left to right, and then only after some time, other people going from right to left. It looked like there was a traffic light, but of course it was not. There was a self-organization principle behind that, based on a pressure gradient that builds up and stops the flow and turns the flow around. So we thought intersections are also bottlenecks, just for a higher number of different flows. Couldn't we apply the pressure principle also to intersections? In fact, we managed to do that, and we managed to create green waves based on a self-organized coordination, as you can see over here. Now, there is a very important point in order to make it happen. If every single intersection just tries to minimize travel times, it means if every single intersection is trying to do the best possible job, the system will fail at high traffic demand. That's interesting because we are usually raised with by parents or teachers or bosses who say, okay, just do the best thing you can. It's not the best thing for the system, it turns out. In order to have a high performance, you need to have coordination with your neighbors. And for this to happen, you need to have a short-term anticipation in this case. So we are measuring the inflow into these sections, and that is actually enough to improve the situation a lot. So here are just a few graphs actually showing that we get new kinds of control patterns, not necessarily periodic or not necessarily one road is served one time each. But it could happen that one road is served 2 times and the side road is only served 1 time. So the classical cyclical control is actually throwing away a lot of potentially well-performing solutions. Now, the whole thing is not only good for theoretical computer simulation for Manhattan-like of idealized networks. Now, we have done it for an area which basically the traffic authorities have given up on. They have state-of-the-art control over there, including a number of green waves. But the problem is that they wanted to prioritize public transport. However, if they did that, they would destroy the green waves completely. There are 8 different lines crossing through this area over here, and they say, okay, if you can show you can do it better, then we're happy. So that was really the greatest challenge one could have, and we did a simulation based on real traffic measurements that had been used to optimize the other system. So it's a fair challenge. And you can see on the right-hand side, trams are starting much earlier and looks less congested. But of course, we don't trust our eyes. We're doing a full-fledged evaluation. And it turns out that we also find the coordination in our new kind of system, but it doesn't have these very regular green waves. We rather have a mechanism that uses gaps as they happen to appear in the traffic flow. And everybody is profiting from that. Public transport is much better off, and also pedestrians and cyclists. But even motorized traffic, which had green waves before, is doing much better. So there's a painless solution to reduce CO2 emissions and reduce energy consumption by applying better ICT solutions. So in conclusion, I would say that, in fact, we can do quite a bit in order to address these different challenges. We have visionary ideas in order to make a difference, to overcome some of the problems and to mitigate others. And we just have to invest some money and some manpower into this in order to attack these different problems. Now, certainly, there are different kinds of approaches, and my preferred approach is based on very simple models, in fact. And I, however, like to point out that sometimes you have to think around the corner. In order to understand social and complex and economic systems, you shouldn't think linearly, because there's a lot of self-organization and emergence going on, and these systems can behave in a paradoxical way. And that's, I think, why we didn't come up so far with very good solutions in the past. Because we try to describe the world as it looks like, while in many cases a much simpler description of reality results if we don't come up with mathematical models that just describe how things look like. Like that would be kind of an epicycle description of the planetary motion. That worked quite well in terms of accuracy, actually. That was a very complicated approach. We know there's a much simpler one. If you put the sun into the center of the planetary system, then we have elliptical motions, and everything is mathematically quite simple. And over here is an example where people are able to describe quite complex patterns based on elementary processes. And the question is, can we do that for social and economic systems as well? I cannot really tell you whether we will succeed in all areas with that. There may be areas where we won't succeed, but we should try how far we can get. And certainly we can get much further than we have been so far. I would say, however, we shouldn't pursue just one approach, because that's quite dangerous. It would be like a recommender system. Everybody does the same thing. We might easily get off the track. So we did actually experiments that show that if people are too much influenced by others, then consensus does not actually mean that they found the right solution. So we need to be very careful about that. We need a pluralistic approach, in fact. And we need to be aware that there are a number of complications in social and economic systems that make them quite different from physical systems that we know can in many instances be described by simple models. But there may be phenomena which in principle cannot be described by simple models. And there are a number of reasons mentioned over here, so we need to be aware of that. I'm very much a supporter of a pluralistic modeling approach. I think we need different approaches to the same problem, and overlaying the wisdom that we gain with these different approaches, we get the best possible picture. And such an approach actually is used today in order to make hurricane prediction, or it's also used in climate science or car safety simulation, or even for airplane control. And so far, I landed safely. So I think Futurist can really make a big difference. It will be the first large-scale ICT project in the world addressing socio-economic challenges of humanity. And we are not only involving hundreds of scientists in this, we're also in close connection with people from North and South America, for example, and Asia, and all sorts of areas in the world. So it's a global research initiative. It's triggered off in Europe and coordinated from Europe. And I think it will revolutionize the social and economic sciences insofar as we're trying to set up a multidisciplinary approach which combines large-scale data mining with computer simulation and experimentation, and of course modeling, which has been done in the past as well. And there will be huge impacts also for policy making, for business and industry, and that's why I think we should really do it. Futurist will lead to a more self-aware society, and it's not expensive. It requires not even a promille of the cost that the financial crisis has created. So we should find this money. Thank you very much.